In this video, I'm going to expand on this existing patch by adding additional sound sources from the Z3000 as well as maybe the noise generator. And I'll also explain some of the parameters on the VCO-6 over here. So currently this is what we have. A Sawtooth sound. Let's unplug out of the Sawtooth output and plug into this fourth output here, which is also a Sawtooth. Sounds exactly the same, but have a listen to what happens when I change this pulse width parameter here. So what's happening here is that we are presented with two Sawtooth oscillators that are slightly out of tune from each other. So as I adjust the pulse width knob, we're adjusting the tuning difference between those two oscillators. So yeah, it's not really a pulse width control, but that's what we get when we're using this particular Sawtooth output. All right, let's switch to this pulse waveform here. And now we get an actual pulse, specifically a square wave. And if I change the pulse width, we're adjusting the pulse width of that square wave. And when it's all the way to the highest, we basically kill the sound completely. There's a slight variation to this on this output here. So it's still a square wave when the pulse width is all the way to the left. But as I adjust this, the tonality is slightly different, but it's still adjusting the pulse width. Alright, aside from that, we have the standard pitch controls here. So this is the octave selector. There's also a fine-tune control here. There's a switch here that needs to be set to audio rate if you want to use this as an audio rate oscillator, but you can also switch to LFO mode and use this VCO as an LFO. I'm going to leave it in audio. Now I want to talk a bit more about this pitch control. So right now I have pitch coming in from the MIDI to CV module that's going into FM2, and the FM2 exponential knob is all the way to the highest. I'm going to play a major scale here. Now let's set this parameter slightly lower, anywhere that's less than 4. And I'm going to play the same scale. So you'll hear that it doesn't quite sound in tune. Let's move this up a couple octaves higher. If I set the knob all the way to the highest, and now it's perfectly in tune. So you want to have this knob all the way up to the highest when you want to control the pitch of this oscillator using that 1 volt per octave system. Alright, now let's introduce this second oscillator into the mix. Thankfully, this filter here has 2 inputs. So even though we're not filtering the sound yet, we can just use this as a little mixer. So I'm going to take the output of one of the Z3000s and plug it into the multi-mode filter's input. So I've taken the square output or the pulse output from the Z3000 and plugged it into the second input on the filter. I've also increased the level on audio 2, which is the second input. So we're getting a pretty interesting result over here. The pitch of this oscillator is tracking the keyboard, but this oscillator is not because we do not have any pitch control on it yet. Now I only have this one output here, and I need to duplicate this over to plug it in over here. And this is where a mult will come in handy. So I'll disconnect this cable and I'll plug it into one of the inputs on the mults. And now from the mult, I can take 2 separate outputs. One can go back in here to control this oscillator, and a second one can go in and control the Z3000. On the Z3000, it's called 1 volt per octave, unlike on the VCO-6, where it was called FM2. Alright, so now both the oscillators are getting that keyboard pitch information. So now when I play on the keyboard, both the oscillators are tracking, but they're not quite in tune. So we can adjust the fine-tuning of either of the two oscillators to get them closer. Instead of the square, we could try any of these other outputs. Let's try the Sawtooth here. Going back to the pulse, we have pulse width control for this as well. Alright, now let's say I want to expand on this and add the noise generator in the mix as well. Unfortunately, this filter only has 2 inputs. So here's a situation where we could use the mixer. So I'm going to take the output of both these oscillators and plug it into the inputs on the mixer. And I'm also going to add in the noise generator, the colored noise generator, and plug that also into the mixer. So now those 3 sound sources are going into the inputs on the mixer. I've set the level at 12 o'clock, so it's not too loud. And then now I can take the output of the mixer and route that back in to audio 1 on the filter. Let's have a listen to this now. Looks like the overall level is a bit quiet, so I'm going to bring up the output on the mixer. So there we have it, 3 different sound sources going in through the mixer, and we're hearing them simultaneously on the output. In the next video, we're going to take a look at the filter in a bit more detail and introduce some modulation options to make the sound a bit more interesting.